good. You have finished another 5 volumes in your 45 volumes of reading Vladimir Lenin. And where did we leave off and where are we now? And as we call this the February Revolution, it actually happens in March.
That's right. We left off, the last we left off was the beginning of World War I. And so in this 5 series that we're talking about today, World War I is still going on. But the 5 volumes intersect with, as you said, the February Revolution, the prelude to October of the same year, 1917. Things happened very rapidly. As you said, Lenin is not himself in Petrograd. He's looking on as things are happening, but he quickly gets himself to Leningrad to participate in the revolution as it's breaking out. I'll just start by issuing a timeline, I guess, of February in particular. On the 23rd of February, that is International Women's Day. There's a parade that's led by women who are advocating for peace and bread within Petrograd. And the city's workers who are already on strike join in on the march. So that by February 24th and 25th, there's over 200,000 strikers on the street. I mean, the city's industries are essentially paralyzed at the time. On the 26th, Nicholas orders the soldiers, the garrison of Petrograd, to fire on the strikers in order to try to disperse them and get them back to work. And the next day, on the 27th, the soldiers refuse to do that. They refuse to shoot at the strikers of Petrograd and the women in the march, and they mutiny. They join the revolution, essentially. The very next day, on the 28th, on Nicholas's trek back from Pskov, back to Petrograd, after he was at the front reviewing the soldiers, his train cart is stopped. The railway workers, in collusion with members of the Duma, they stop his train cart, and they essentially kidnap him within the train. And it's in the train on March 1st that the Petrograd Soviet, the deputies of the Duma, effectively have him kidnapped. On March 1st, the Petrograd Soviet issues what's called Order Number 1, which effectively gives the city Soviet control over the garrison of the city. And on March 2nd, Nicholas abdicates the throne formally. He abdicates the throne on behalf of himself and his son, Alexei. Alexei is the hemophilic son that probably wouldn't have been that great of a Tsar anyway if he had lived. And Nicholas's brother, Mikhail, declines the throne. And so, overnight, in a series of just a few days, 300 years of Romanov dynasty collapses. And that's where we essentially are. That's the history of the February Revolution. Now, what's going to happen is those Duma members who had helped orchestrate the abdication will go on to form what's called the provisional government. The government is just that. It's provisional. It's supposed to be a temporary government tasked with creating a constitution for what should be a new Russian Republican form of government. But at the same time, those Soviets who had issued Order Number 1, the Petrograd Soviet who had issued Number 1, they're Soviets in all the major cities, are a competing form of legitimacy of power, in the sense that, for the most part, they have the support of the urban workers. They have the support of many soldiers and sailors stationed within Petrograd, the biggest naval city in the empire. And the provisional government doesn't really have much. They have title. A lot of them come from aristocratic families, and so it's not completely a doing away with the aristocracy. But we have the situation of dual power, and that's where we are with these new 5 volumes. That is volumes 20 to 25, or is it 25 to 30? I forget. It's one of those. There's so many volumes now that you know, beginning with volume, I'm going to say it's 20. Beginning with volume 20. Yeah, those listeners might be familiar with what was called the Zimmerwald left. As I had mentioned in the previous roundup that we did of these five, there was a huge split in socialist parties, the Second International, when the war started. The big question was whether or not socialists of the International should support their home country. So the German Social Democrats, for example, the question for them was, do we support Germany in the war effort? If we don't, we'll probably lose credibility among the working class. But if we do, then we're obviously violating socialist principles, which are anti-imperialist and anti-war. So that split occurs. The Second International falls apart, and Lenin and some of the radicals meet in Zimmerwald, Switzerland, to form what's called the Zimmerwald Left, or the Zimmerwald International. And it's in the context of the Zimmerwald International that Lenin outlines his theory of revolutionary defeatism, as opposed to what he called chauvinism, or imperial chauvinism, or national chauvinism, whatever you want to call it. Revolutionary defeatism was the argument that the Tsarist Empire must be defeated in the war, that the socialists should not give support to Russia in its war effort, and that a defeat of Tsarism, because the Tsar had not abdicated at this point yet, a defeat of Tsarism will usher in the necessary revolution, the necessary civil war. And so Lenin takes the side of being against Russia winning the war. That doesn't mean that he wants Germany to win. He doesn't want anybody to win. He just believes that if one power falls, then the rest of them will kind of fall in a domino. He's still very much an internationalist at this point. And with that in mind, another big theme that he's talking about in these 5 volumes is the theme of self-determination. We all know from our history classes, and if you don't know, you can take my class on European history that I'm offering in May. We'll talk about that later. The theme of self-determination becomes a kind of buzzword in the West as a way of reconstituting the European order at the end of the war. That is, breaking up the big empires of Austria, mostly Austria, and parts of Germany, into their own nations, so that Serbians, for instance, could have control. They could have self-determination over their own nation state. And Lenin writes extensively about the topic of self-determination at this point, arguing that, well, if you're going to prioritize something like self-determination, you should extend that to not just the peoples within Europe, but all imperial colonies throughout the world. That all oppressed peoples under the heel of empire deserve their own autonomy. And he says we can't have real revolution until those people have autonomy. And he's writing specifically about Finland and Ukraine at this time, saying that, the Finnish people, for example, they can't make agreements with Russia on an equal basis so long as they're not equal, so long as they are under the heel of the Russian Empire. It's also in these 5 volumes that, within these 5 volumes, that he writes his famous work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, in which he lays out this kind of this new form of imperialism that is characterized or just summarized in kind of 3 parts. First, there's the partitioning of the world, and Africa is a good example of that. The partitioning of Africa happens in the late 19th century. Then there is imperial extraction of those raw materials, and the process of extraction also relies on building transportation infrastructure and transportation companies, new organizations, cartels, corporations, et cetera, and then the creation of monopolies for the export of finance capital throughout parts of the world. Thereby, imperialism has this way, he says, of linking global economies into these broader capitalist monopolies. That's the kind of heart of the imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. He also, in these 5 volumes, engages with a lot of other socialists. I mean, at this time, you have to think there's a range of socialist theories springing up. There's already a split in the international and on different sides. And one of these people that is maybe a little bit too enthusiastic about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, is Pyatkov, who's another Russian social democrat. And Pyatkov argued that finance capital made it so that genuine democracy and self-determination were impossible. That was his argument, that it was impossible so long as finance capital was ruling the day. And so therefore he argued socialists should drop it. They should drop the call for democracy and self-determination. But Lenin makes this kind of nuanced argument where he says imperialism doesn't destroy democracy, it merely distorts it. It turns it into something else. And so in that case, in this period, again, this is before the abdication of the Tsar, Lenin is saying, actually, this is after the abdication of the Tsar at this point. Lenin is saying that the party in that case needs to work within the structures of government to advocate for democratic reforms. So at this point, he's still very much a part of advocating for the working class in official institutions and structures, while also advocating for revolution. As I said, Lenin is not in Petrograd in February, but from afar, and he writes these letters from afar. To his colleagues that are in Russia, he is driving home the point that as the provisional government is formed, it's very important for the Bolsheviks and their members within the Soviets to make it clear that they give no support to the provisional government. He comes back to Petrograd in April 1917, and that's where he issues what are called the April Theses. The April Theses are kind of a bullet point list of slogans and platforms that the Bolsheviks, that he recommends the Bolsheviks abide by. So the first is obviously no support to the provisional government, that all power should be in the hands of the Soviets. The second is to abolish the police. Another one is to nationalize the land and nationalize the banks. Because he understands that the transition from a capitalist form of banking into a socialist form of nationalized banking isn't something that happens overnight, but something that can be facilitated by a centralized national bank. Of equal interest in this period, and something else that Lenin is writing about extensively as he comes back to Petrograd. But first of all, it's important to point out that most of the Bolsheviks did not support the April Theses at all. They thought that he was a little bit crazy. This guy that hadn't been in Russia for years, that was looking at it from afar, they thought that he was maybe out of touch with things as they were going on. So Lenin, first of all, has to publish prolifically in defense of his April Theses, but he also has to defend himself and the other Bolsheviks who were allowed passage back to Russia from Germany. Keep in mind, this is during World War I, and so the question would be, well, how did a Russian take a train through Germany, who Russia is at war with, and make it all to Petrograd without some kind of collusion with the German government? The liberal newspapers, particularly Reich, which is a liberal rag, and even the Mensheviks, they go on this offensive against Lenin to try to chip away at his stature and his influence within not just the party, but the working class of Petrograd, by pointing out that he had to have been a German agent. And this is a topic that historians still talk about a lot, and they debate over. Lenin's primary defense of that was to say that it wasn't the German government who gave us passage through the territory, but rather it was German socialists, people like Karl Liebknecht, who financed his movement and other members of the party. With that, even while he's in a newspaper, essentially a newspaper war with liberals and with Mensheviks and with just about everybody, the Seventh All-Russian Conference of the party meets. And it's at this meeting where he concedes that so long as the provisional government still controls the military and still controls the police, it's important for the Bolsheviks to advocate, demonstrate, and get out there, but remain peaceful. Because what he argues, and this is important, is that as soon as a Bolshevik does something violent, it's going to give the provisional government the excuse to crack down on the Bolshevik party as a whole. And there are instances in which the provisional government does either seize Bolshevik newspapers or raid Bolshevik headquarters a few times. And then the other task of Lenin in these newspaper articles, because that's the majority of what are being read, is this controversy over the so-called note of the provisional government. A big question, a big theme of the war. The reason why Nicholas II, the Tsar, went to war, as some people argue, is because the Allies, Britain and France, promised Russia territory in exchange for their help. In particular, they promised Russia territory in the Balkans, and most importantly, territory in the Northern Caucasus and Constantinople, the Orthodox capital of the world, or Istanbul, as the Ottomans had renamed it. So Nicholas is a very devout Orthodox Christian. He wants Istanbul, right? That's kind of that's the Rome of the Orthodox Church. It's the capital of the Orthodox Church. And this note that comes out in 1917 from the provisional government was essentially a note passed between the ministers of the provisional government that argued that that Russia, despite the Tsar abdicating and autocracy being over, that Russia should continue the war. This was a huge deal because, as Lenin says, any revolutionary worth their salt who knows anything about Russia at the time understood that everybody wanted Russia to leave the war. It's what all the strikes and protests were about. And so the idea that the provisional government decided to stay in the war, Lenin says that that's a reflection of their capitalist background and their capitalist overlords, right? The people who are really controlling the government are those who have financial interests in the territory promised to them by the Allied powers. And so Lenin says, they're throwing Russian children, Russian soldiers out to the front for their own benefit. It's around July at this point now where things start to turn for the worse for the provisional government. On the one hand, the new prime minister, Alexander Kerensky, decides that the best way to try to regain popular support for the provisional government is a renewed offensive in the Western Front, or in the Eastern Front as we know it. It's a disaster. I mean, it's sort of baffling how often bourgeois liberal politicians think that war is good for drumming up support. Sometimes it does work, I guess. In 2013, right, with the Iraq War, it worked, but for the most part, it doesn't always work, as Donald Trump is finding out now. And the July offensive for Kerensky was an absolute disaster. The Russian offensive, the renewed offensive, ended very swiftly. And it's at this point where Lenin says that the time for any collaboration with the provisional government has finally come to an end, in that now the vast majority of the population are on the side of the anti-provisional government. I won't say that they're on the side of the Bolsheviks, but they are on the side against the provisional government. And the last kind of blunder that the provisional government makes is Alexander Kerensky realizing that the strikes have gotten out of hand, they're out of control, the police, the military have all turned. He essentially phones a general, Kornilov, to come and restore order in the city so that the provisional government can lay down the law. What Kerensky underestimated is how ambitious generals typically are. Which is the case, I think, always. And so this General Kornilov, of course, he agreed to come, but he intended on installing a military dictatorship within the city. This is something that Kerensky didn't really anticipate, at least that's what the sources say. But we do know that it was Kerensky who kind of mobilized the whole event to begin with. But once he realizes that they intend to form a military dictatorship, Kerensky tries to call it off. Kornilov, of course, is not going to call it off. Continues, and so Kerensky opens up the armories within Petrograd and essentially tells workers and soldiers to arm yourselves to defend the city. Now you have a population that is against the provisional government, that is armed, and so Kerensky is sort of over with. The worker strikes are at an all-time high. The industrial production within the city is paralyzed. The food rations within the city are paralyzed. The peasantry are not sending their goods to the city. And it's at this point that Lenin writes The State and Revolution, which is the last major work in these 5 volumes. The State and Revolution is where he lays out his theory of the state, saying that the state is an instrument of class rule. It sounds like a simple argument, but for Lenin, it's a quite complex argument in the context, or in the sense that if there is to be a dictatorship of the proletariat, the purpose of the dictatorship is to seize the state. That is the instrument of class rule, so that the state can then become an instrument of working class rule. And then he lays out this idea, this Engels idea of the withering away of the state, commonly misunderstood theory, in which he says that there comes a point within this proletarian dictatorship where the punitive mechanisms of the state can wither away. They can disappear. There's no longer a need for them in the path towards communism. He's not arguing for some kind of anarchistic anti-state theory, like some anarchists think. And that brings us to the end, right on the eve of October. It's at this point in September where Lenin is saying definitively, no more collusion with the provisional government. They've lost all credibility, and it's time for the Bolsheviks to seize power. And if they don't do it now, then they will miss their world historic opportunity. And so that's the big cliffhanger. The next 5 volumes are on October and the immediate fallout. So that's where we are with Lenin in 45 volumes.